So we're getting a lot of questions about whether dry blasting or wet blasting is better and which one's greater to get started in, and a variety of similar questions. So we're going to go ahead and address some of those today. So one of the biggest questions is dry blasting that much different than wet? Ultimately, both serve to remove a coating or something you don't want off the surface of a product and prepare that surface usually for something to be applied on it, like a paint, protective coating, or a similar situation. The biggest benefit that wet blasting offers over dry blasting is that it allows for dust suppression. Now we can sell both dry and wet blasting equipment, so we tend to try to just present the facts as they are so you can better know whether or not it makes sense to get into one over the other. Where dust suppression typically is most important is if you're doing a lot of jobs where significant dust is a problem. And that's commonly an issue if you're doing a lot of work in highly populated areas. But ultimately what you should do to ensure that wet blasting would make sense, because the equipment for wet blasting is typically significantly more expensive than dry blasting equipment, is actually work out and look at job opportunities that you have in your area for blasting and ask if they want it to be a wet blast only application. If your area isn't specifying and dictating that you have to have wet blasts, then the additional headaches that come with wet blasting may not make sense for you, and additionally the extra expense for the equipment to do wet blasting may not be worth the initial or extra investment that you may have to make. While there are some other benefits to wet blasting, for example, it can slightly reduce the impact on the surface of a product, which can help to be a little easier to blast delicate surfaces. Oftentimes you'll see a wet blasting unit being used to strip a car, and as if it's just a very simple process. But regardless of whether you're wet or dry blasting, blasting a delicate surface is relatively difficult, even with the water, which can help slow down the impact of media or reduce the impact of media. For really dry, delicate surfaces, you typically will be using a similar type of media, whether you're wet or dry blasting, whether that's a corn cob, shell, or a very fine crushed glass media. But ultimately, the media is what will be important, and then the pressure and the way you blast. So while there's a lot out there showing that wet blasting will do a lot of things above and beyond dry, for the most part, they're going to be relatively similar, except that wet blasting offers superior dust suppression. And there are certain applications where the wet water that's being added to the blast media may help increase speed slightly. That's particularly applicable with, I've seen it with powder coating removal, where removing a powder coating will often be benefited by using a wet blast versus a standard dry. You also have to think too, when you're using a wet blast, you do have extra media or expenses to do the work. You have to use a rust inhibitor so the surface doesn't corrode right after you're done blasting. And that solution, usually hold tight's a very common option for that, is an additional expense that you're going to incur as a blaster. You can also get into wet blasting in the future at some point if you want to start as a dry blaster with adding a wet blast injection nozzle, or on a budget level you can add just a water ring, though those aren't typically as efficient at suppressing dust as a water injection nozzle. Comparatively, if you just wanted to go out and buy all the equipment to get started wet blasting, you are often looking at anywhere from $12,000 to $25,000 and higher if you're going with a full pre-done package. You can get similar results from buying a wet blast injection nozzle, around $3,500, which can be added to any dry blast pot, which the initial cost of dry blast pot can range from $4,000 to $5,500, which makes the initial expense a lot more reasonable. So if you're thinking about wet blasting, to make sure it's worth the while of your money to invest in the equipment and get started, your best route would be to look at local job opportunities for blasting to see if you require wet blast to be able to do those jobs, and then ask others who are doing wet blast contract work in other areas to see, is this equipment investment worth the additional money that you might spend? And finally, to confirm whether or not some of those details about whether it's faster and more efficient and waste less media are really going to apply for your particular blast application. It can apply. A lot of times though, both wet and dry are going to be similar, but wet's biggest advantage by far is the ability to suppress dust. So we hope some of this helps you if you're considering wet blast or dustless blasting as an option. And if you have questions, you can leave them in the comments and we'll do our best to answer them. We do sell both wet and dry blast systems and have fair familiarity with both.